Good day to everyone, and an extra special hello to all students who are viewing this video. Welcome to another lesson from Excel with L. Today's lesson will focus on the direct and indirect object in sentences. Every sentence must have a subject and a verb. It is true to say that a group of words without either a subject or a verb or without both of these is not a sentence. Then there are some sentences that contain an object or objects. Understand, however, that a group of words does not need an object to be considered a sentence. Now let's prove this on the upcoming slide. Now we have two different sentence patterns here. In the first sentence pattern, we're seeing the subject and verb sentence pattern. So it reads, my mother cooked. The subject is my mother. The verb is cooked. So we're seeing here that a group of words can be made up of only a subject and a verb, just those two things, but the group of words is still a sentence. In the sentence pattern below, we are seeing that you can have a sentence with an object. My mother cooks pilau. The subject is my mother, the verb is cooked, and then there is the object pilau. But what exactly do we mean by the concept of the object? And in particular, what do we mean by the direct object? So, on one hand, there is the indirect object and then there is the direct object. Let's move on firstly to try to understand the concept of the direct object. Now, by definition, the direct object is the person who or the thing that receives the action of the verb. There is an easy way to identify your direct object by asking yourself whom or what of the verb. So, to be able to ask yourself whom or what of the verb, of course, you have to be able to first identify the verb in the sentence. Now, let's try to understand even more the concept of the direct object by going through some examples. Our first example is one of the sentences I used earlier. My mother cooked pilau. The direct object here is pilau. Now let's understand how we arrived at that. Now remember, I did say that you can identify your direct object by asking whom or what of the verb. In this case, you will ask what of the verb. You identify the verb here is cooked. That's right. Cooked what? The answer that you get is pilau. Hence, pilau is the direct object. So basically, what we're saying is that pilau is the thing that receives the action of the verb. So the verb passes on its action to the word pilau, hence the direct object. Example 2. It reads, the villagers welcomed the tired men. So our objective here is the same, to identify the direct object. Remember, the direct object is defined as the person who or the thing that receives the action of the verb. A simple way to identify the direct object is by firstly identifying your verb and then asking whom or what of the verb. So the verb here is welcomed. Welcomed whom? The answer that you get is the direct object. So the direct object here is the tired men. So the tired men, they are the ones who received the action of the verb. They are the ones who received the welcoming, hence the direct object. In our next example, Christian and Ken enjoy fish and chips. Think about this for a few seconds. Remember what we said? The direct object is the receiver of the action of the verb. You identify it by first identifying your verb and then asking yourself whom or what of the verb. So let's go. Good. So the verb here is enjoy. So you ask, enjoy what? When you ask that question, the answer that you get is fish and chips. We therefore say that fish and chips are the receivers of the action of the verb, hence the direct object. Now, let's turn our attention to understanding what we mean by the indirect object. And I have three different sentence patterns here. The first one, the subject and verb sentence pattern, mother baked. Number two, subject and verb and direct object, mother baked a chocolate cake. So remember the direct object. You find the verb, you ask yourself, in this case, what of the verb? Baked what? The answer that you get, that's your direct object, a chocolate cake. Number three, we have the subject, the verb, the indirect object, and the direct object. And the sentence reads, Mother baked John a chocolate cake. Mother is the subject, baked is the verb, John is the indirect object, and as we said before, a chocolate cake is the direct object. So consider for a few moments this sentence. Look at what we say is the indirect object, John, and then tell me, well, in your mind, try to think of what we mean by the indirect object. And that's correct. The indirect object is the person who or the thing that receives the direct object. So remember, the direct object receives the action of the verb, but the indirect object receives the direct object. Now, to identify the indirect object, there are also certain questions that you can ask. So, the indirect object can be identified by answering the questions to what, to whom, for what, and for whom. Now, it is very important that you understand that a sentence can only contain an indirect object if there is a direct object in the sentence. And think about it. This makes sense because we said a while ago that the indirect object receives the direct object. Therefore, if there is no direct object in a sentence, then there's nothing to receive. Then there is no direct object to receive. Therefore, without a direct object in a sentence, there can be no indirect object. Let's look at some examples. The first example reads, Pam wrote John a letter. Now, in this sentence, the indirect object is John. Let's see how I arrived at that. So, we did say that the indirect object is the person who or the thing that receives the direct object. So, firstly, identify your direct object. Your direct object can be identified by asking, in this case, what of the verb. The verb is wrote. Wrote what? A letter. That's the direct object. The question now is, who is the recipient or who is the receiver of this letter, the direct object? To whom did Pam write a letter? The answer is John. Therefore, John is the indirect object because John is the receiver of the direct object. Following? Let's move on to example number 2. The loving old man gave his wife a kiss. Again, our objective here is the same, to identify the indirect object. But firstly, we must identify the direct object and then see who is the receiver of the direct object. So your verb here is gave. To identify the direct object, you ask yourself, gave what? The answer is a kiss. So that's the direct object. Now, who is the receiver of this kiss? To whom did the old man give a kiss? The answer is his wife. So the indirect object in this sentence is his wife because his wife is the receiver of the kiss, which is the direct object. And our final example, example 3, Cassano bought my puppy a chew toy. Take a few seconds, try to figure out this one on your own. Okay, let's see. So the first thing is to identify the direct object. Identify your verb, which is bought. Bought what? A true toy, that's the direct object. So the indirect object is who is the receiver of the true toy? Who is the receiver of the direct object? For whom did Cassano buy a true toy? The answer is my puppy. Therefore, the indirect object here, the receiver of the direct object is my puppy. So what we have seen is that there are some sentences that contain a direct object. The direct object is defined as the person who or the thing that receives the action of the verb. We can identify the direct object by firstly identifying the verb and then asking whom or what of the verb. We see as well that there are some sentences that contain both an indirect object and a direct object. The indirect object is the receiver of the direct object in a sentence. So while it is that the direct object receives the action of the verb, the indirect object is the receiver of the direct object. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel Excel with L, especially if you found this content useful. Until then, keep excelling.